Jake had not slept in 2 days, and he did not care because sleep felt like a waste of time when you were standing at the edge of something that no human being had ever stood at the edge of before. Something so big and so heavy with meaning that even the cold, recycled air of the transport shuttle seemed to taste different, seemed to carry the quiet weight of history in it. And Jake sat in the back of the small crew shuttle with his hands resting on his knees, watching through the narrow viewport as the asteroid belt grew closer and the stars behind it burned bright and still, the way stars always burned, without any care for what was happening below them or around them, without any interest in the fact that this day was not a normal day, that this moment was not a moment that would pass and be forgotten. And Jake thought about that for a while. Thought about how the stars had looked the same 200 years ago when the Veth Conquered first appeared above Earth and told the people of humanity that they were too small, too violent, too primitive to move freely through the galaxy. And the people of Earth had looked up at the sky and seen alien ships the size of cities blocking out the light of the sun, and they had done the only thing they could do at that time, which was agree, which was lower their heads and accept the lines that had been drawn around their solar system like a fence around a yard. And Jake remembered reading about that in school, remembered feeling something hot and sharp in his chest when he read the words of the Veth Concord's official declaration, which said that humanity was to be contained for the safety of the greater galactic community, and that any human vessel found beyond the boundary line would be destroyed without warning. And Jake had carried that heat in his chest for his entire life without fully knowing what to do with it, until the day Admiral Nora had called him into her office and placed a single photograph on the desk in front of him. A photograph taken from a long-range deep space camera, showing something massive and dark being assembled in the shadow of the asteroid belt. And she had looked at him with calm, steady eyes and said that humanity had been building its answer for 30 years in secret, and that the answer was almost ready, and that she wanted Jake to be the one to take it out into the stars. And Jake had looked at that photograph for a long time, not saying anything, just looking, because there were no words big enough for what he felt in that moment, and so he had simply nodded and said yes. And now here he was, 2 days without sleep, sitting in a shuttle that was getting closer and closer to the asteroid belt. And when the pilot finally said over the intercom that they were 2 minutes out and that Jake should look to the left viewport, Jake turned and looked, and the breath left his body completely. Because there it was, the UN Aegis, sitting in the dark between the rocks like a mountain that had learned to float, 14 kilometers long from bow to stern. Its dark hull plated with layered composite armor that had been tested against every weapon the UN science teams had been able to study or reverse engineer from alien wreckage. Its spine lined with rail cannon arrays that could fire hypervelocity rounds at a fraction of the speed of light. Its forward section housing the plasma lance batteries that could cut through the hull of a Veth cruiser like a knife through paper, and along its sides, row after row of fighter launch bays sat sealed and ready, waiting for Kyle and his pilots to bring them to life. And at the heart of the ship, deep in its reinforced core, was the thing that Amy had spent 11 years of her life building and perfecting, the microsingularity power system. A contained point of gravitational collapse that produced more raw energy than any reactor humanity had ever built before. Enough energy to run every weapon on the ship simultaneously for hours without breaking. And Jake sat in the shuttle and stared at the Aegis as the shuttle moved slowly alongside its hull, and he thought about the thousands of engineers and scientists and welders and programmers and soldiers who had given pieces of their lives to this ship in secret, who had worked in hidden stations and underground facilities and orbital docks that didn't appear on any public map, who had said nothing to their families about what they were really doing, who had carried the secret the way you carry something precious and dangerous at the same time, carefully with both hands, never letting it drop. And when the shuttle finally docked and the airlock opened and Jake walked aboard the Aegis for the first time, the first person he saw was Amy, standing at the end of the docking corridor, with a tablet in her hand and grease on her sleeve, and the particular look on her face that she always had when she was close to something that worked. A look that was not quite a smile, but was more than calm. A look that said, "Everything is ready and I know it is because I checked it myself." And she handed him the tablet and started walking, and Jake walked beside her, and she talked quickly and clearly about the power output levels and the shield calibration tests and the weapon charge cycles and the fighter bay readiness checks. And Jake listened to all of it and understood most of it and trusted the rest because Amy had never once in her career been wrong about a system she said was ready. And when they reached the bridge, and Jake stood at the center of it and looked out through the forward viewport at the open dark of space beyond the asteroid belt, beyond the boundary line, beyond everything that humanity had been told it was allowed to have, he felt the heat in his chest again. The same heat he had felt as a child reading about the day humanity lowered its head. But now it was different. Now it was not sharp and helpless. Now it was steady and quiet and sure. The way a fire is sure when it has enough fuel and enough air and enough room to breathe. And he turned to the crew on the bridge, to Ryan at the weapons console, and to Kyle's voice already crackling in over the fighter bay comm line asking if it was time yet, and to all the faces watching him and waiting, and Jake took one slow breath and said, simply and without drama, that it was time to take the ship out, and the Aegis began to move. The UN Aegis crossed the boundary line at exactly 0:00 hours ship time, and nobody on the bridge said a word when it happened, because there was nothing to say that the moment was not already saying for itself. And Jake stood at the center of the bridge with his hands behind his back and watched the navigation display as the ship moved past the invisible line that the Veth Concord had drawn around humanity's solar system 200 years ago, the line that no human vessel had crossed without being destroyed. And the ship did not shake, and the alarms did not go off, and the stars outside the viewport did not change. They just kept burning the way they always burned, quiet and indifferent, and Jake thought that was almost funny, that a moment this large could look so ordinary from the outside, that crossing the most important line in human history felt no different in the body than crossing any other point in empty space. And Ryan at the weapons console let out a long, slow breath that he had clearly been holding for some time. And from the fighter bay comm line, Kyle said quietly that they had just made history, and that someone should write that down. And Amy, standing at the engineering station behind Jake, said that someone had better focus on their job instead of making speeches, and Kyle laughed and said, "Yes, ma'am." And the bridge returned to the quiet professional focus that Jake had trained his crew to hold even when the world around them was anything but quiet. And they did not have to wait long before the world became anything but quiet, because 17 minutes after the Aegis crossed the boundary line, the long-range sensors lit up, and Ryan turned from his console and said in a flat, even voice that he was reading 43 Veth Concord vessels dropping out of faster-than-light travel approximately 80,000 kilometers ahead. And Jake said acknowledged and did not move from where he was standing, and on the forward viewport the stars were joined by new lights, the cold blue-white running lights of Veth warships assembling into formation with the kind of smooth, practiced precision that came from 2 centuries of never being challenged. Because the Veth Concord had not fought a real war in a long time, they had given warnings and they had fired on small ships that could not fight back, and that was the only kind of power they had practiced, the kind that does not need to be careful because the other side has nothing. And Jake watched their formation take shape on the display and recognized it immediately as a standard Veth intercept pattern, wide in the front, with the larger cruisers holding the center and the smaller escort ships fanning out on the flanks, a formation designed to surround and overwhelm. And then the communication channel opened, and the voice that came through it was the voice of a Veth fleet commander named in their own language by a title that the translation system rendered simply as High Warden. And the High Warden spoke in the clipped, formal tone of someone who had delivered this same message many times before and expected it to work exactly the way it had always worked. And the message was simple and old and familiar. It said that this vessel had violated the terms of the Galactic Containment Order issued to the human species, that this vessel was to stop all movement immediately and power down all systems, that failure to comply would result in the immediate and total destruction of the vessel and all crew aboard, and that the Veth Concord offered this warning once and once only, and when the message ended there was silence on the bridge, and Jake let the silence sit for a moment, let his crew feel it. Let everyone remember that they had heard this kind of voice before, not this exact voice, but this exact tone. This tone that assumed it had already won before anything had happened. This tone that had been pointed at humanity for 200 years like a finger pressed against a chest. And then Jake looked at Ryan and said, "Hold all weapons, do not fire, do not power down, hold position." And Ryan said, "Yes, sir," and turned back to his console. And then Jake opened the comm channel and said in a calm and level voice that the UN Aegis was a vessel of the United Earth Navy operating in free space, that it had not fired on anyone and did not intend to unless fired upon first, and that it would not be powering down or stopping its movement, and he closed the channel. and on the display the Veth formation did not move for almost 30 seconds, which Jake suspected was the amount of time it took for the High Warden to process the fact that a human ship had just told him no. And then the Veth fleet began to move, closing the distance slowly and deliberately, and then without further communication, the High Warden made his point the way the Veth Concord had always made its points, and the lead Veth cruiser fired a directed energy weapon, a focused particle beam that had been used to split human ships in half on multiple recorded occasions, and the beam crossed 80,000 kilometers of space in less than a second and struck the forward shielding array of the Aegis dead center. And Amy's hands moved across her console before the beam even finished hitting, and everyone on the bridge who had never been fired at in their life tensed in the way that bodies tense when they expect something terrible. And then Amy said in a voice that was almost too calm that the shields had absorbed 100% of the impact, and that the hull had taken 0 damage, and that the microsingularity was operating at 31% output, and the bridge was completely silent for 3 full seconds. And then Ryan made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a shout, and Kyle's voice burst through the comm line from the fighter base saying that he had felt that and was everyone alive up there. And Jake said everyone was alive and told Kyle to stay ready but stay put. And then he looked at the forward viewport where the Veth fleet was still holding its position, still waiting, and he imagined what it must have looked like from the other side. Imagined the moment the High Warden saw his flagship's primary weapon hit a human ship and do absolutely nothing. And Jake thought that must have been a very strange and very unpleasant feeling for someone who had spent his entire career assuming that humanity had nothing. And then the Vethcom channel opened again and the High Warden's voice came through, and this time the tone was slightly different, still formal, still cold, but underneath it there was something new. Something that had not been there before. Something that sounded almost like a question trying to disguise itself as a command. And the message was the same as before: power down, stop, comply. But it did not land the same way it had landed the first time, because now everyone on the bridge of the Aegis had seen the beam hit and seen it fail. And Jake opened the channel and said quietly and without any heat in his voice at all, "We heard you the first time, we just don't listen anymore." And he closed the channel, and beside him Amy looked up from her console and met his eyes, and neither of them smiled, because this was not the moment for smiling. This was the moment just before everything changed, and they both knew it. The High Warden did not wait long after Jake's last transmission, and nobody on the bridge of the Aegis expected him to, because a commander who had just watched his best weapon bounce off a human ship like a pebble thrown at a wall was not a commander who was going to sit still and think things through carefully. He was going to do the thing that commanders do when they feel embarrassed and afraid at the same time, which is throw everything they have at the problem and hope that more of the same thing that already didn't work will somehow start working, if there is enough of it. And so the Veth fleet began to move all at once, all 43 ships pushing forward in a wide aggressive sweep. And the sensor board in front of Ryan lit up with contact markers and range numbers that were shrinking fast. And Ryan looked at Jake, and Jake looked at the display and said in a quiet, steady voice, "Kyle, launch all fighters." And the sound that followed was one of the best sounds Jake had ever heard in his life, which was the sound of every fighter bay door on the Aegis opening at the same time. A deep rolling mechanical thunder that moved through the hull of the ship from bow to stern. And then Kyle's voice on the comm said wings 1 through 6 are away. And on the forward viewport, Jake could see the small, fast shapes of the fighter craft pouring out of the ship's sides like sparks off a fire, spreading wide and fast in every direction, drawing the eyes of the Veth fleet, pulling their targeting systems towards smaller, faster targets, giving the Aegis the one thing it needed more than anything else right now, which was a few minutes of breathing room. And Amy was already at her console calling out numbers in the calm, fast voice she used when the situation was serious and she needed Jake to hear only the important things. And she said the microsingularity was climbing toward 44% output and that the primary rail cannon array was charged and holding and ready to fire on his order. And Jake said, "Hold, not yet, let them come closer." And Ryan turned from his console with an expression on his face that was not quite fear and not quite impatience, but was something between the two. And he said, "Sir, the Veth lead cruiser is the same class as the one that destroyed the Exeter in the border incident 4 years ago." And Jake said he knew that, and Ryan said nothing else and turned back to his console because he trusted Jake the way you trust someone who has always been right before, even when being right required waiting longer than felt comfortable. and the Veth fleet kept coming, and Kyle's fighters kept moving, weaving through the incoming ships in tight, fast patterns. Not firing yet, just moving, making noise, making the Veth targeting computers work harder than they were used to working. And then the Veth began firing on the fighters, and the space between the two fleets turned bright with energy discharges and rail slugs and the short, hard flashes of fighters rolling out of the way at the last possible second. And Kyle's voice was sharp and fast on the comm, calling out positions and vectors to his pilots, and Jake listened to it and kept his eyes on the main display and waited. And then Amy said the Veth lead cruiser was at optimal range. And Jake said, "Ryan, primary rail cannons, target the lead cruiser, fire." And Ryan said, "Yes, sir." And his hands moved across his console with the speed of someone who had practiced this moment 10,000 times in simulation, and was grateful beyond words that the real thing felt the same. And the Aegis fired, and the sound and the feeling of it was something none of them had expected, even though they had all been told what it would be like. Because there is a difference between being told something and feeling it, and what they felt was a deep, hard shudder that moved through the entire ship from front to back, a shudder that felt less like a vibration and more like the ship itself exhaling. And on the display, three things happened very fast. First, the rail cannon slubs crossed the distance to the Veth lead cruiser in almost no time at all. Second, the lead cruiser's shields, which were among the best shields in the Veth fleet, collapsed completely under the impact. And third, the lead cruiser broke apart, not slowly, not in pieces, but all at once. A clean, catastrophic structural failure that sent debris in every direction in a perfect expanding sphere, and the bridge of the Aegis was silent for 1 full second. And then Ryan said in a voice that did not sound entirely like his normal voice, "Target is destroyed." And Amy said, "Micro-singularity at 51%, all systems nominal." And Jake said, "Recharge and target the next cruiser." And Ryan said, "Yes, sir." And his hands were already moving, and outside the viewport, the Veth fleet had stopped its forward movement. Every single ship, all 42 remaining vessels, had simply stopped, the way a person stops when they see something that does not fit inside the world they thought they understood. And Jake watched them stop and felt nothing dramatic, felt no great rush of triumph or heat of revenge, felt only the clear, cool certainty of a man who had spent his whole life preparing for a moment and was now simply living inside it. And then the plasma lance batteries fired on the second Veth cruiser, and the third before the first shot had even finished, lighting up the dark. And 2 more ships came apart. And now the Veth formation was not a formation anymore. It was a collection of ships that were each making their own decision about what to do, and what most of them decided to do was move backward. And some of them decided to move sideways, and a few of the smaller escort ships decided to turn around entirely and go back the way they had come. And Kyle's voice on the comm said that the fighters were reading mass Veth withdrawal across the board and asking if they should pursue. And Jake said, "No, let them go, do not pursue. Bring the wings back in." And Kyle said, "Understood." Pulling back now, and the fighter bays began to receive the returning craft one by one. And Amy walked up beside Jake and looked at the display with him and said that the micro-singularity had peaked at 63% during the firing sequence and had come back down cleanly, and that the ship had taken no hull damage and no shield penetration during the entire engagement. And Jake nodded and kept watching the display as the last Veth ships disappeared off the edge of the sensor range. And he thought about the High Warden somewhere out there in the dark. Thought about what it felt like to be that man right now, and he did not feel sorry for him, but he did not feel anything cruel either. He just thought that the galaxy had spent a very long time running on one set of rules, and that those rules had changed today, and that the stars outside the viewport still looked exactly the same as they always had, burning quietly, not caring. And somehow that felt right. The battle footage reached the Galactic Council before the Aegis had even finished pulling its last fighter wing back through the bay doors. Because space is full of listening stations and long-range optical arrays and automated relay buoys that record everything that happens near them and send the data out in all directions without caring what the data means or who it will frighten. And what the data showed was 43 Veth Concord warships moving in on a single human vessel with total confidence and then coming apart and running in less than 11 minutes. And that footage landed on the screens of every major civilization in the known galaxy at roughly the same time. And the reactions were not all the same, because the galaxy is not a simple place, and the species that live in it do not all want the same things or fear the same things. But there were some things that nearly every reaction had in common, which were silence first, and then a great deal of very fast talking, and the Galactic Council called an emergency session within 6 hours of the footage going wide, which was the fastest emergency session in the Council's 400-year history. And Admiral Nora watched the session request come in from her office on Earth and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was the particular satisfaction of a plan that had taken 30 years to build finally doing exactly what it was built to do. And she straightened her jacket and told her assistant to prepare the subspace relay for a full council address, because she intended to speak first, and she intended to speak clearly. And, on the other side of the galaxy, in the cold metal corridors of the Council's orbital station, the representatives of 31 spacefaring civilizations were already filing into the great circular chamber where the seats were arranged in rings around a central platform, and the noise in that chamber was not the organized noise of a normal session. It was the noise of 31 groups of beings all trying to understand the same thing at the same time, which is always loud and always slightly panicked. And the representative from the Veth Conquered sat in his high seat at the front of the chamber and said nothing and looked at nothing in particular, which was a look of a person who is trying very hard to appear calm while something inside them is falling. And the session was called to order, and the footage from the engagement was played again on the central display for everyone who had not yet seen it clearly. And when the third Veth cruiser came apart on the screen, the chamber went very quiet in a way that felt less like silence and more like every being in the room holding their breath at exactly the same moment. And then Admiral Nora's face appeared on the subspace relay screen at the front of the chamber, and she looked out at the 31 civilizations watching her, and she did not apologize, and she did not ask permission, and she did not use the careful, soft language that humans had been expected to use when addressing the Council for 200 years. And she said that the UEN Aegis was a vessel of the United Earth Navy, and that it had been built by human hands, using human knowledge and human resources, and that it had crossed the quarantine line not to make war on anyone but to prove that the line itself had no meaning anymore, and that humanity had not fired first and had not pursued the retreating Veth fleet and had not done anything except defend itself and stand its ground. And she said that humanity was not asking the Council for permission to exist in free space because humanity did not need permission. It needed only the same right that every other civilization in the galaxy already had, which was the right to go where it chose and to defend itself when threatened. And she said that right was not something the Council had given humanity, and so it was not something the Council could take away. And when she finished, the chamber was quiet again for a long moment, and then the talking started again, louder than before. And some of the representatives were clearly angry, and some were clearly frightened, and some were doing something that looked almost like trying not to show how pleased they were. Because the Veth Conquered had not only quarantined humanity over the years, it had also pressured and bullied and quietly threatened a number of smaller civilizations into agreements they had not wanted. And those civilizations sat in their seats and watched the Veth representative's face and felt something that was warm and quiet and careful. The feeling of watching someone who has held power over you for a long time suddenly discover that power has limits. And meanwhile, aboard the Aegis, Jake and Amy were standing in the engineering bay next to the micro-singularity housing. A reinforced sphere 3 meters across that hummed with a deep, steady vibration you could feel more in your chest than hear with your ears. And Amy was walking Jake through the post-engagement diagnostic with her tablet in her hand, pointing out the stress readings from the firing sequence and the heat distribution patterns across the containment field. And she said that the system had pushed to 63% during the engagement and had come back down without any field instability, which meant the containment architecture was stronger than even her most optimistic models had predicted. And Jake looked at the housing and listened to the hum and asked what the theoretical maximum output was before the containment risk became serious. And Amy said 100% was the hard ceiling and that she was confident in the system up to 85% before she would start to feel nervous. And Jake nodded and said, "Let us hope we never need 85. And Amy said she agreed, but that she had designed it to handle 90 just in case, because that was how Amy approached every problem. Not by hoping for the best outcome, but by quietly preparing for the one after it. And Jake looked at her for a moment and said that he was glad she was on this ship. And Amy said she knew that and went back to her tablet, and Jake walked back toward the bridge alone through the long corridors of the Aegis, past crew members who stood straighter when they saw him coming and who had a different look in their eyes now than they had had this morning. a look that was not quite pride and not quite relief, but was something that sat between the two like a fire that had just been lit and was still deciding how large it was going to become. And Jake walked past all of them and nodded to each one and thought about Nora's address to the council, and thought about the Veth Concord sitting in that chamber with the footage of their fleet, running from a single human ship, playing on the screen above them. And he thought about the 200 years that had led to this day, all the small surrenders and lowered heads and careful words, and he thought that none of those years had been wasted, because every one of them had been fuel. And the Aegis was what happened when you gave humanity enough time and enough reason and enough quiet anger and then got out of the way. The Veth Concord's formal demand arrived at UN High Command 48 hours after the battle, transmitted through the standard diplomatic channel in the cold official language that the Concorde used for all its communications with humanity, and the demand was exactly what Admiral Nora had expected it to be, which was a long document full of serious-sounding words that all meant the same simple thing, which was that humanity should take the Aegis apart, should dismantle its weapons and its shields and its micro-singularity core, and reduce it back to the raw materials it was made from. And the document called the ship a threat to galactic stability, and a violation of the containment order, and a danger to the peace that the Veth Concord claimed to have maintained for 400 years. And Nora read the entire document from the first line to the last, and then she set it down on her desk and looked out the window at the sky above Earth, which was blue and wide and full of light the way it always was on a clear morning. And she thought about the word peace and what it actually meant, because she had spent her whole life watching the Veth Concord use that word to mean something very different from what it was supposed to mean. And what they meant when they said peace was the kind of quiet that happens when one side has all the power and the other side has learned not to make noise. And Nora had never believed that kind of quiet deserved to be called peace. It deserved to be called what it was, which was silence kept by force. And she picked up a pen and wrote her response in her own hand on a single sheet of paper. And the response said that the United Earth Navy thanked the Veth Concord for its communication and that humanity's answer was no, and she signed it and had it transmitted. And then she made a call to the 3 hidden shipyards that had been quietly finishing their work for the past 2 years, and she told them that it was time, and the shipyards began their final preparations. And 3 days later, on a clear morning with the sun coming up over the Eastern Ocean and the sky turning from dark to gold above the UN orbital command platform, 3 new ships emerged from behind the asteroid belt and moved slowly into open space for the first time, and their names were the UN Resolve, and the UN Resolve, and the UN Defiance, and the UN Covenant, and each of them was the same class as the Aegis, the same length and the same weight, and the same weapons load and the same micro-singularity core humming at their hearts. And when the long-range sensors on every ship in every fleet in the local star cluster picked up the signatures of those 3 vessels moving in formation with the Aegis at the front, the reaction was something that had no single word for it in any language, because it was too big and too fast and too full of different feelings all at once. And aboard the Aegis, Jake stood at the forward viewport and watched his ship's 3 sisters take their places beside him on the display. And Kyle's voice came over the comm from the fighter bay and said in a quiet voice that he was looking at the formation on his screen and that it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. And Jake did not disagree. And Ryan at the weapons console said that all 4 ships were reading green across every system. And Amy's voice came over the internal comm from the engineering bay where she had been working without stopping for the past 36 hours. And she said that the micro-singularity was running clean, and that the post-battle recalibration was complete, and that the Aegis was ready for whatever came next. And Jake said, "Thank you, Amy." And she said she knew, and the 4 ships held their formation in the open dark beyond the quarantine line and waited. Not because they were afraid, but because waiting was a choice this time, a choice that belonged to humanity and not to anyone else. And at the Galactic Council, the chamber had been in continuous session since Nora's address 2 days ago. And the arguments going back and forth were long and loud and full of the kind of fear and pride that make arguments go in circles. But there was one thing that even the most frightened and most angry voices in the chamber could not argue against, which was the footage on the screen and the 4 ships on the sensor display, and the simple fact that the conversation had already changed in a way that could not be unchanged. and some of the smaller civilizations in the chamber had stopped arguing against humanity altogether and had started arguing with each other about what this new reality meant for them and whether there might be advantages in being friendly to a species that could build warships like the Aegis in secret and still have the discipline not to fire first. And the Veth Concord representative sat in his high seat and looked at the screen and understood something that no amount of formal language or official demands could change, which was that the map was different now, that the lines drawn on it 200 years ago were gone, not because anyone had officially erased them, but because the Aegis had crossed one and nothing had happened. And once a line fails to stop the thing it was drawn, to stop it is no longer a line. It is just a memory. And meanwhile, back on Earth, in the cities and towns and small quiet places where ordinary people lived their ordinary lives, the news had been playing the footage on every screen for 2 days straight, and people had stopped on streets and in shops and in the middle of whatever they were doing to watch the Aegis fire and the Veth ships run. And the feeling that moved through the population of Earth was not the loud, sharp feeling of a crowd watching a fight. It was something slower and deeper and more private than that. It was the feeling of a weight being lifted that had been sitting on the chest of the whole species for so long that most people had stopped noticing it was there. And children who had grown up being told that the stars were not for them watched the footage and felt something open up inside them that had always been closed before. And Jake did not know about any of that as he stood on the bridge of the Aegis and looked out at the stars, but he felt it somehow, felt the size of what had happened in the way that you feel the size of something true, even when you cannot see all of it. And he thought about his father who had wanted to be a pilot and had been told the quarantine made deep spaceflight pointless. And he thought about his mother who had looked up at the night sky every clear evening and said nothing but whose face said everything. And he thought that this moment was not his alone and was not the crew's alone and was not even humanity's alone in the way that one generation can claim a thing, because it belonged to all the generations that had come before and lowered their heads and kept going anyway and passed their quiet anger down like a torch through the dark. And the stars outside the viewport burned the way they always burned, steady and cold and completely indifferent, and the Aegis moved forward into them, and this time it did not stop.
Thanks for watching my video. Like, subscribe and share.